You're 5th in the SGA. So if I ever need anything, I know who to go to. You know Ashley Triplett?
Yes.
Yeah. Me and her go way back. We were student assistants together at U of L 10 years ago now.
Really?
Yeah.
So, okay, if you were a student assistant 10 years ago, you're like 30.
That would be some type of math.
Well, I mean, you were probably 20 when you were a student assistant.
What if I started at 18? What if I started at
So that puts you
25?
between 28 and 32. Is that correct?
You ever seen the movie Benjamin Button?
Yes.
Maybe that's what's happening.
Oh,
I'm actually 106.
I don't buy that.
I just look great for 106 though.
Has anybody actually finished Benjamin Button?
I've never actually seen it. I just make the same joke every year, and less students catch the joke because less and less people have seen the movie. But I'll never change. I don't adjust. Actually, guys, I'm gonna do something to you that you're both gonna hate. Can you get up and move back? Because I want to keep the front row clear because I feel like as the semester goes, it's better if we separate ourselves somewhat. Just out of pure, just leave the front row empty. Scoot on back, please. Thank you, guys. That's what you get for being sarcastic.
Yeah.
That's what you get.
I'm being
Get out of here. Go home. All right.
No, hey, don't worry. Now you won't see me typing up my complaint.
That's why he's in the second row, so that we can be a smart ass when he doesn't send it back.
You know, whatever row you've been in has never been like a barrier to you being a smart ass, so I don't think the second row is going to change much.
I would like to see it from
Oh, yeah, so that's fine. If you want to take that, I need it. All right, I got 2 o'clock. What time do you got? 2 o'clock?
Yeah.
Let's do this thing then. So, do we have any housekeeping we need to do? I feel like we're all kind of on the same page, right? Oh, housekeeping. One housekeeping thing. I went ahead and posted the first discussion board. I haven't seen anybody respond, but that's no big deal. It's not due until next Sunday night, not this Sunday night, next Sunday night. Reminder, every discussion board, you need 1 original post and minimum 2 response posts to get full grade, okay? So that the first one's up. You guys have been reading the article. You should be in good shape. Sound good? All right. Let's see if anybody is joining us. Nobody's joining us online, so I'll just leave this up. I'll post it to Blackboard. I'll send you guys an announcement. That's how I'll do it pretty much every time after that, is it'll be up within a few hours, depending on how lazy I am, how efficient I am. So, where do we leave off?
Fog of war.
Fog of war. So we just finished our kind of overview of some very simple military theory explainers. So now we're going to get into the actual history side of things. So let's start with, where are we? The pre-modern period, what we might consider the late medieval warfare. Before we can start discussion of the warfare itself, we have to understand the society that produced it. It's going to be a consistent theme in this class. Warfare is a product of society, ergo we need to understand a little bit about the society that produces it. In 1500, in Europe, there is one single context that dominates all other aspects of life in Europe, and that's what? Religion. Religion is the barrier, the explainer, the definer of the medieval and late medieval period. It will be the impetus for Spanish colonization, English colonization, French colonization. It will eventually be the explainer for several things in the American military. Religion is a massive motivator at the time. In fact, before the birth of the nation state, it is the primary motivator. It's important also that we understand we're not really talking about modern states when we say France, Spain, England. We're talking about what? They're not states, they are they're monarchies, they're kingdoms. Kingdoms mean what in terms of how they're organized? They belong to who? They belong to the king and to the nobility. And the king and nobility are also generally what in terms of the society? They are what kind of class? Yes, absolutely. In terms of their function, though, in terms of this class, they are also the ruling and military class. Military service at the time is also part and parcel of being a noble. Your average commoner does not exist in terms of how the state conceptualizes them. There's no such thing as citizenship at this point. Kingdoms are the personal property of the king and nobility. Governance is done by the king and nobility together. The average person has zero input in it. And so as we'll talk about this later, America really is kind of the first attempt at the citizen soldier. At this point, that doesn't exist. The military caste is also the political caste, and those two things are inseparable. Make sense? Let's talk about religion then. At the time, by about 1500, there is only one religion in Europe. That is, there's multiple. There's only one important one. We'll just start with Christianity. You're absolutely right. Christianity is the only religion in Europe that you would consider a state religion. Jews certainly exist in Europe, but they are usually seen as not only others, they are usually a very much put upon class. Muslims, as you might expect in a heavily Christianized Europe, are persona non grata. It's the same society that produced the Crusades, the same society that would be at war with the Muslim Turks for the next 200-300 years. Christianity is the sole definer of Western Europe. By 1500, though, we have this goofball who enters the stage. That's who? Martin Luther. Martin Luther, brilliant theologian, starts what? What was it? He writes up some theses. What do those theses eventually produce? What we would consider the Protestant Reformation. So, thanks to him, Europe is divided into two overarching religious camps, Protestants and the Catholics. Those two camps, obviously within Protestantism, there are lots of smaller branches. We'll talk about the English version of that later as it impacts this class. However, we cannot divorce what happens over the next several slides, and therefore over the next several hundred years, from an intense competition between Protestant and Catholics. This is the driver of most of the early European wars, as we will find out. Alongside Martin Luther and his theses is a growing belief among Protestants that the Catholic Church itself is problematic. The selling of indulgences, the inability of state actors to see the failures of the Inquisition, problems within the Catholic Church create those who protest, Protestants. Generally, they saw slightly different interpretation of religion within the same hierarchical structures. Catholicism relies on hierarchy. Protestantism relies on individual what? Choice. Individual choice.
What year was Martin Luther on the front?
Oh, Martin Luther. Let's just say, to make it nice and easy, Martin Luther is 1500-ish. Because by the mid-1550s, we have two armed camps. I'm not too, just as an FYI, I don't care too much about dates in this class. Names and concepts.
Just directional. Yes,
exactly. That's a good question. So, concurrent to this is also what we would consider the Long Reconquista, an important part of the growth and the spread of the Spanish Empire, the group that will get to the New World first. The Reconquista takes place in what country? What modern country? Spain. And it's led, or finished at least, the Reconquista is nearly an 800-year process. The Reconquista is finished by these two monarchs. They are Ferdinand and Isabella. Feel free to shout it out in this class, guys. I think we have enough people. It'll be okay if we just shout out. Ferdinand and Isabella, the two monarchs who finally, in what very important year, finished the conquest of Muslim Spain. 1492. Very good. Very coincidental year, eh?
Yeah, the Moors, right?
Very good. The last Moorish kingdom, one second, Christian. The last kingdom, as you can see from here, I'm going to step up. Over the last 800 years, this green space that you see disappearing are the Muslim kingdoms in Spain. Over 800 years between several Spanish countries, Castile, Aragon, Granada, etc., have been pushing the Muslims slowly but surely out of Spain. The word Reconquista means reconquest, and it's very much a religious war. The war ends in 1492 when Ferdinand and Isabella take the last Muslim stronghold at Granada, finally expelling the Moors from Spain. What this creates for the Reconquista and for the Spanish themselves is a large and powerful army that they have developed over many years of fighting. Now, they no longer have an enemy. And so the Spanish will use this army and used what's left of essentially a major power to start what? What would we consider the next step? What we call the age of exploration. For all of his faults, they do pick a guy who takes them to the New World, and that's who? Christopher Columbus. Famous not because he accidentally discovered India, but because he was a very, very bad mathematician. Columbus's central conceit, his central idea that he took around to the courts of Europe, was that the Earth, if you sailed west, you could reach India. Most, if not all, Europeans understood that the world was round at the time. It's a complete misnomer that they all thought they'd fall off the side of the world. Columbus, though, was very, very bad at math. In that, he and I have lots in common. Columbus thought the world was significantly smaller than it was, and so his belief that you could sail west across the Pacific was largely and completely stupid. And so many courts turned him down, not because they were worried they'd lose some sailors falling off the edge of the world, but they were worried what?
Take too long to get there.
Not even going to take too long to get there. They wouldn't make it. The average caravel you'd sail in probably had about 3 months worth of supplies that you could make it through. The numbers he was presenting were wrong. Had there been no North and South America, they would have died somewhere around Hawaii looking for food and drink. In the end, what he ends up with, though, is a king and a queen who have what?
Money.
Money, time, and soldiers. Ferdinand and Isabella give him the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria and say, have at it, because if they lose 3 boats and a few hundred men, big whoop. If he's right, you get what? You might have new trade routes, you might have new access to India. At the time, Spain was in direct competition with what other Iberian nation for exploration? Very good. Portugal had been exploring a lot longer than this, though generally Portugal was aiming where?
East.
Africa. Portugal had figured out how to get into the Indian Ocean through Africa some years before under their Prince King, Henry the Navigator. He gets his name because he was good at navigating. Shocker, shocker. Prince Henry has created essentially a Portuguese empire to the east. Spain then aims west. It's a very simple setup. And in the end, it's a good luck Charlie kind of deal. And at Columbus, despite how crappy he was at math and despite how much of a genocidal nut job he ended up being, he finds the New World. And the division of the New World will be very important. So keep that in mind, we'll come back to that. At the same time, we need to understand what's happening in Europe's military systems, because the New World will be a transplant of European ideas about military, and also the gold and silver of the New World will do a hell of a lot to make the Spanish Empire big, powerful, and absolutely unwieldy. So let's start with what you guys know. In the top left, you see the primary driver of European military systems, and that's who? We're talking about the knightly class, essentially. For most of the medieval period, the knight was paramount. As we mentioned with the, what do you call that? The stirrup. Christian, the leg thing. As we mentioned with the stirrup, that had allowed cavalry for the better part of 800 years to dominate the European battlefield. However, it was expensive to maintain, equip, train a knight. You didn't just want them to die on the battlefield. That represented a loss of 30 or 40 years of experience. Most knightly battles, most of the big battles over the course of European history, saw relatively few casualties of the knightly class. Instead, who tended to die on the battlefield? The peasants who came with him, in the tens of thousands often. We see this over and over at Bouvines, at Bannockburn, at you name the battle, they died in the thousands. Knights, however, were captured for what? Ransom. This is not what we would obviously consider professional warfare, right? In fact, it's quite the opposite. The knightly class had far more in common with those in other countries of the same class than they ever did with their social inferiors at home. So what you often saw, not only was an intermingling of the knightly class across what we would consider national lines, but we also saw very conflicted states because they weren't really nation states. For instance, we've all heard of the Black Prince, Edward II, Edward III's eldest son, John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt, at one point in 1372, was the independent Prince of Aquitaine, the son of the King of England, the Duke of several lands in France, and heir presumptive of the Spanish kingdom. Does that sound like a particularly normal nation-state setup?
No.
Right.
Seems pretty.
Pretty all over the place, right? That's the whole point. The prince had far more in common with his fellow princes than he ever did with the peasants who served in his army. And so, the medieval period is marked by what we would consider non-professional warfare. The knightly class fought, the peasants died. However, whether the Black Prince knew it or not, he himself happened to contribute to the decline of the knightly class. What thing the English that I showed you last time used began killing knights from a distance? A longbow. The longbow is our first real introduction, as well as the crossbow. Just get both of these on the thing at once. Once knights could be killed by peasants, what did that mean for the social order? It's upside down, right?
Yeah.
If I have to fear my peasants can accidentally shoot me with a crossbow, oh shit, they might have more political power than I want them to. Again and again, the English longbow would win victory after victory for the English. And we're not talking about by mowing down a bunch of peasants. We're talking about thousands of knights, French knights, dying at battles like Poitiers, Crécy. Anyone know the last one in 1415? Agincourt, very good. Over and over. We can add Najera to that, but that was in Spain. The longbow mowed down French or Spanish knights. A complete flip over of the entire ideology of knightly warfare. Europeans at the time didn't remark too much on that, though it's interesting, once the crossbow was invented, which took significantly less training and physical strength, obviously, has anybody ever drawn a bow before? It's a physical thing, right? When you draw a bow back. A longbow takes a ton of torque. It takes a long time of training. English longbowmen had to spend every weekend pretty much practicing. There's a law written up by Edward II in 1252 put in the first requirements for the English to learn how to shoot a longbow on the weekends, in a weekend sport, which obviously was pretty good for the warfare of the period. In fact, the crossbow, which took even less work to learn and use, the Pope tried to ban its use at one point.
To say that, yeah.
Exactly, because it could do what?
Shift the power balance.
It could kill people that it shouldn't be killing. That's a little bit silly to say, given this class is about the military and death, but there are times in this class where we're going to say some crazy things about who the military was supposed to kill. Medieval warfare should not be killing knights, as bizarre as that sounds. Peasants, you can die. These guys you ransom, usually for a lot of stuff. The ransom of King Jean, captured by the English after Poitiers, provided the English with a ransom beyond reckoning. In the end, the French don't pay it, but that wasn't the point.
These days, they just be mowed down along with the peasants.
Very
just
good.
Without a second thought.
That's going to be something we really move into. At the same time, by the 1500s, one new context has showed up that's going to change everything. And that's the introduction of what technology? Gunpowder. What we would consider the gunpowder revolution.
Oh, it's really gonna be this now.
You have no idea. The gunpowder revolution and the introduction of gunpowder weapons. Obviously, early gunpowder weapons in pre-modern Europe were slow to load, deeply inaccurate, prone to breakdowns, things that we would consider less common in today's gun culture, very common then. Generally, you could expect a flintlock musket to misfire 1 out of every 3 times you pull the trigger. At this time, the major gun in the society wasn't the flintlock yet, it was what?
The handgun.
is a combination of what we would call pike and matchlock. A matchlock rifle or a matchlock gun works slightly differently than a flintlock. You actually have to stick it on a holding thing because it's a big, heavy gun. Keep a lighted fuse in your hand to touch off the powder. Now, because of how slow it was to fire these, usually one bullet every few minutes, as opposed to being able to spray a few machine gun bullets everywhere now, because of that, you had to find a way to protect these men. And we would call this the integration of pike and matchlock. It's sometimes called pike and shot, is the better way to remember it, because these two things had to be done together. You had pikemen who protected you from who? Right. The knights, the charge of heavy cavalry. Pikemen can ward off cavalry, because there's one thing you cannot train a horse to do, and that's what?
Not be afraid of,
Pointy objects. Knights have a very hard time forcing even well-trained horses onto a line of pikes. So as long as you could keep the knights away from you, your soldiers and your musketeers could do what? Keep firing, exactly. The combination of these two leads us to what we consider the pike and shot era, basically from the 1500s to the late 1680s. Eventually, the development of the flintlock, the main gun we'll talk about in this class, will replace both, because a flintlock allows you to place a bayonet at the end of it, and that's the combination of pike and shot, right? Infantry can now ward off cavalry by himself. He doesn't need a pikeman to do it for him. During this period, the Spanish find themselves not only the richest of the empires in Europe, but certainly also the best at this style of warfare. The Spanish again and again in both France, the Low Countries, and Germany find that they're simply much better at this than everybody else. Their primary unit was called a tercio. A tercio was their big pike units that they used to maneuver around the battlefield. The best commanders, like the Duke of Alba, were very good at putting these two things together and turning them into successful battlefield victories. Battlefield victories were then translated into what, hopefully?
Territorial gain.
Territorial gain. Battlefield victory then becomes political victory if you can enforce it, right? Now, the interesting thing about this era is, thanks to the way that kingdoms were owned, it was relatively easy for territory to change hands. This is a very, very important concept. I need you guys to make sure you understand it. Because for the vast majority of this period, all the way up until essentially the American Revolution, kings owned this land. They were not beholden to the populace for its opinions. They did not give a shit who lived in these territories. They were as easy to trade as it would be to trade Pokemon cards. Is that a reference we catch?
No.
Yu-Gi-Oh cards, I don't know.
So let's say that you're a peasant and you're fighting for the French.
Mhm.
Then the French lose, and now the Spanish own your land.
Mhm.
Now you're conscripted to fight for the Spanish. But would that happen?
Oh yeah, all the time.
impressment.
We'll get to impressment later.
Well, yeah.
It's more even basic than that. Once the territory changes hands, did you ever really consider yourself French? How would a peasant in the 1450s or 1500s even have a national identity? Did they?
Is that a lord, right?
You had a lord who you were responsible to. You had no conception of a nationality because it didn't exist yet. We won't really talk about nationalities the way we consider it until essentially the French and American revolutions. That's what I need you guys to get your brain out of. These are not nation states. These are the personal property of the royals who own them. In fact, the American colonies, as we'll see, are the same damn thing. Americans themselves only developed what we would consider an American identity around 1750, well into the period we consider nationalism. Nationalism doesn't even exist as a concept really until the 1790s. So think of it more as, I'm a peasant, I don't give a shit what happens to me because I'm broke, hungry, and gonna die anyways. What's it matter that I die for the Count of Lamarche versus the Duke of Alba? There's no real difference for me. The only class that would care about that is who? The knightly class. But again, do the knights really care also?
Nah, not
Why not?
Because it'd still be respected by the higher-ups of the other.
Exactly. Because the knightly class is far more in common with its same property class, it doesn't even care that much. European territory changes hands rapidly at this point. The way we draw national borders today would be very hard for them to understand because there was no national consciousness yet. You weren't French, you were Parisian. You weren't Spanish, you were from Aragon. Exactly. You weren't German, you were from one of the many German states. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Think of that context. That's the key context here. Now, at the time, warfare was what we would consider bloody and indecisive. By this, I mean these battles, given that they were largely about killing the peasants and then trading territory, meant that warfare itself often was largely indecisive. Campaigns took a long time. They often had no real resolution. Battles and wars could lead to almost no change in movement over the course of many years. We're about to talk about the central war of the territory in the period that lasts 30 years without any real decision being made. Wars were much longer during this period than they are, well, I'd say than they are today when we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. In the end, though, gunpowder changes everything. Two men, we have to know their names, two men will be largely responsible for instilling what we would consider the birth of professionalism. And it's just a birth, it's an infant. Birth of professionalism. At a very early stage, several very smart European military commanders thought about the ways in which they could make warfare more useful for their nation states, or at least for their territories, is a better way to think of it. Two, in particular, dominate this conversation. These two men. You recognize either. That's okay. Not Frederick. We'll get to Frederick. Old Fred is going to be a big guy in our class. Not Fred. On one hand, on the left, we have Maurice of Nassau. Nassau is the little territory he owned in the modern Netherlands. And the second, anybody? I'll tell you he's Swedish. Does that help?
Yeoman?
Gustav. Very good. Gustavus Adolphus. Both of these men want to change the militaries they own. They want to make them more professional, more organized, less about knights and more about winning. And the way they see that happening is to professionalize them by standardizing things. Does that make sense? If you have every goofball who's in your army who thinks, if you have every goofball in your army who thinks that he knows what he's doing because he's a knight and he's been trained that way and he doesn't really need to listen to the commander, what do you have? Thousands of different thought processes happening on a battle. And what did I say is the most important part of military victory? Organization.
Coordination.
So, if you were a medieval commander looking for a way to organize your forces or looking to find a way to make things more professional, how would you do that? Is there maybe some past writer, some past empire that you could look to for explanation?
The
Romans. These men looked up old Roman textbooks, quite literally. Maurice of Nassau, in particular, was a big fan of two writers. You may know him, you may not. Tacitus and Vegetius. Always want to have like broccoli after I write his name there. The two of them, in turn, will dominate what we consider the wars of religion. Because both of them realized that to move warfare forward, to move warfare into a more decisive period in which their countries and their empires could grow, and absolutely Gustavus Adolphus grows the Swedish Empire essentially from nothing, from a backwards poor country into the leading power of the Baltic. They do so through standardization and organization. Obviously, They don't arm and equip their men like Roman legionnaires, but they read the books of these Roman writers, lost, or at least thought to be lost, for hundreds of years. And the things that both have been stressed over and over again are the things that made the Roman Empire win. Organization, and another concept we must learn, a concept that all soldiers today consider impossible to divorce from military success. And that's what? This is harder. This is really kind of hard.
Standard issue.
Organization and combined. Say it again. There it is. Combined arms. What does combined arms mean?
Several different armaments of warfare being used together to fulfill a single purpose.
Close, more.
Like how you align your infantry and your cavalry, trying to coordinate.
It's
that.
the interplay.
Interplay of the two.
Exactly. Interplay of different military, oh God, what's the word I'm looking for? Systems.
Once you have aircraft, it's even more.
Exactly. At the time, there's only 3 parts of combined arms. And for all of this class, there will only be 3 parts. They are,
Infantry, cavalry, and
that's it, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The interplay of these 3 things. Now, did the Romans have infantry, cavalry, and artillery?
I mean,
Absolutely they did, very much so. The legionnaires, auxiliary cavalry, and the Romans loved siege equipment. The Romans understood the best way to defeat a bunch of barbarians without tactics was what? Simply out-organize them. The Romans were brilliant not because they were particularly great soldiers, though they were. They were so good at organizing, marching, and fighting as a unit. I don't know if you guys know this, but the Romans were famous for no matter where their legion camped at night, no matter how far it had marched, no matter how much it had fought, every night they built the same fort every single time. So that just in case there was an attack on the camp that night, it was always built on the same grid lines. A Roman soldier could get dressed in the dark and find his spot on the wall without ever feeling like he was in a different camp, stretching from Britain to Syria. That's what made the Romans so good. They organized. That's how these men saw it. Organization was the key to victory, and they were dead right.
like machines, pretty much.
Exactly. The Roman legionnaire was not a man, he was a machine. Would it be good to see the Roman legion act? You guys want to watch a quick video?
For sure.
Yeah, sure, why not?
It's hard to see, it's hard to envision it without seeing it. Y'all ever seen the TV show Rome?
Yes, I love that show.
Very good show, very good show.
Yeah.
What is it on?
It's an old HBO show. It's probably still on there. It's a great show. This is a battle. These are Romans. The guys you hear yelling are barbarians. But you can fit just about any one of Rome's enemies into this. These are your legionnaires. And they are a unit, first and foremost. Watch this carefully. See how organized they are as opposed to the barbarians just rolling on in? The Romans weren't soldiers, they were a machine.
There's another good one in Gladiator.
Gladiator.
The very beginning.
Mm-hmm. That's a great one too. I showed that one too, but you kind of get the flavor there, right? The idea was that, as you saw from the Romans, they rotated units, they used signals, they were very, very organized. The barbarians they fought again and again, fought for the same cultures that produced them. The cultures that produced the barbarians over and over again were largely individualist warrior societies, in which personal bravery mattered more than organization. Does that make sense? Christian, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I would imagine that like the Romans would feel a responsibility to the entire unit while they were fighting.
Yes.
So was that not the case for medieval armies, like their infantry, like
Correct. On average, the peasants who showed up to field in these medieval field armies, the first thing they did once battle was joined was what? Run. They had what's the point of being loyal to a system that at home starves and beats them? Generally, when they showed up on the battlefield, it's because they'd been pushed into combat by their social betters. The knights were the only ones who mattered on a battlefield. So if your side lost and you were a peasant, what could you guess would happen? You'd be killed. What's the incentive of fighting hard for that? There's a reason that it's hard for us to understand today as citizens of a nation what it was like to be in that system. You had no say in it. You had no choice in it. The average peasant's life was starvation, work, death. That's that. It sucks ass, but that's how it was for tens of millions of European peasants. The only person who mattered on the battlefield was the knight, because he's the only one who could command the ransom to make it worthwhile to keep him. We will see this again in American warfare, as Americans coming from Europe have a very different definition of warfare than, say, the natives who were produced by very different cultures. And so these cultural clashes often got really ugly, because they didn't just have different styles, they didn't understand one another culturally. Make sense? So, to continue with this point, these two men are central to what we consider the wars of religion. The most important war of religion, and the one I want you to think about the most, is the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War takes place exclusively in what we consider modern Germany. But we have to, again, get rid of in your brain what you know about modern Germany. At the time, Germany was actually a collection of more than 2,000 different little states. Some were bigger than others. Some were as small as quite literally a knight's landholding. They were called imperial knights. But all of them were responsible to the bigger organization of the Holy Roman Empire itself. There was no Germany. There were certain German states, some bigger than others. Eventually, one state will emerge from the chaos that was Germany for several hundred years and stamp itself on the rest of Germany. And that's what state? Prussia. Eventually, Prussia will come to the fore. But at this point, there's a little different ones. And the 30 Years' War, as you might expect, given what I just said, is fought over what? Religion. And it is a bloodbath. It lasts for 30 years. Several periods of it are excruciatingly awful. More often than not, warfare during the 30 Years' War wasn't organized. It was bands of soldiers wandering across Germany, killing and looting at will. This is a picture of a very typical day in Germany during the 30 Years' War.
Which one?
Top left. Death,
Oh, yeah.
murder, bloodshed. The third, let me give you an idea. I want you all to listen in real close here. To give you an idea of how fucked the 30 Years' War was for Germany. In 1962, Germany, or the Pew Research Center, I'm sure you've all heard of Pew Research Center, they do topics of all kinds of things and they poll populations. 1962, they polled Germany and asked Germans what the worst event in German history was. We're not too far from what event in 1962? The Holocaust and World War II. And the Germans overwhelmingly picked the 30 Years' War as the worst thing to happen to Germany. That should tell you how damn important it was. As much as a third of the German population was either killed or displaced. It set Germany back hundreds of years towards unification. The 30 Years' War was a product of these religious wars. And because of that, as you might expect, religion doesn't tend to bring out people's best, right? It tends to bring out their passions, their anger. And at a time where religion was the most important context, sectional hate between Protestant and Catholic led to atrocity after atrocity on these battlefields. Does that make sense? We would call this warfare unrestrained. It's very important we understand just how much the bloodletting of the 30 Years' War freaks Europe out. Because after the 30 Years' War, what we'll see is a slow and gradual transition to organized, professionalized, and less brutal warfare. Oddly enough, even though that's a very, very, what you call that statement, less brutal warfare is oxymoronic, right? The idea being, though, Europeans recoiled from the horrors of the 30 Years' War. There's no other way to put it.
Basically hell on earth.
Hell on earth is a great way to put it. In fact, if I can remember which one of the Germans said it, several of them described it similarly.
Like goring babies and shit.
Exactly.
Was it, like between the German states, or was it foreign powers acting within Germany?
Great question. Very good question. It initially started between the states. And as you guys can see from this bizarre border map, they were all over the place. The way that religion happened at the time was not a personal choice. It was the choice of who? Your prince. It was the choice of your ruler. So if you were a Bavarian, whatever the religion of the Bavarian king was, the Bavarian prince was also
Yours.
his peasant's religion, or the rest of his subjects. And so you could have Protestants living right next door to Catholics. And so all across the region, what you get is a whole bunch of my neighbors who 20, 30 years ago I wasn't too mad at, now I'm going to kill in anger because of the changes in our religion. Now, as you asked, was there foreign interference? Well, where did I tell you Gustavus was from? Sweden. See Sweden in the top? Gustavus was a Protestant and involved himself in the 30 Years' War, A, because he believed in the Protestant cause, and B, because he wanted to territorially aggrandize Sweden. So yes, there's a lot of interference. That interference will be particularly important for this man. Does anybody recognize the cardinal in red? One of the most famous politicians in French history. I'll give you a hint. He shows up in all the Three Musketeers movies as the villain.
Oh.
Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu. The chief advisor, it's not Charles, Cardinal. You can spell it from there, you see here. My style is next. Richelieu is an oddity. He was a priest, actually, and he was an advisor to King Louis XIV, a young Louis XIV, who will eventually become known as the Sun King, one of the most important kings in Western European history. Richelieu is an oddity at a time where the entirety of Europe is being torn apart by war. Richelieu is a little bit more far-seeing. He understood that France's security, he was the Cardinal of France, he understood that France's security was dependent on France developing what? A national conscience. Kind of odd. Richelieu, despite being a priest, wanted to see France become a nation. He was one of several important statesmen at the time who were far-seeing enough to understand that the state must centralize power, take it from the nobility if it has to, and turn itself into organized, powerful kingdoms. Richelieu had to do this, obviously, over the objections of the French nobility itself. We call the wars in which the French actually destroyed their own nobility a Fronde, F-O-R-N-D-E. There's a reason the French go from one of the most important and over-the-top military classes in the Western Europe to a bunch of guys whose job it was every morning to wake up and quite literally put on Louis XIV's pants. They fought over the ability to put on his pants. It became that important. Richelieu and the French nobility, Richelieu neutered the French nobility, is the best way to put it. But for that to happen, for all of these countries to do that, they had to break the back of their nobility. Because did the nobility want things to change? No, of course not. They didn't want to see a more centralized monarchy. Why not? It threatened their power. The stronger the monarchy, the weaker the nobility. And so each country in Europe is fighting this exact same battle. The country that America will develop from is fighting it too. In fact, it's having its own version of the Fronde. The English version of the Fronde is called what? They're not very inventive with the English Civil War. Nope, War of Roses before this one. This is just the English Civil War.
With the Cromwell.
Bingo. Cromwell, you see him pointing and telling Parliament what to do, The English Civil War goes further than the Fronde. In the end, what does Parliament decide to do to their king? They chop his head off. A very, very, very shocking move for all of Europe. This is one of the first executions of a European monarch, and the first electorally executed monarch ever, though the Stuarts will have their revenge. Every one of the English barons who signed his execution warrant were hunted down and murdered.
Oh, shit.
What is
Yeah.
that called when they kill?
Regicide.
Yeah,
Regicide. So, we understand the war is a religion. Okay. What's important about Cromwell, and the reason I poke him in here, is the English, to whom the American states will eventually descend, are going through their same struggles too. All of Europe is fighting its way through these religious wars. And these religious wars are redefining the relationship between the state and nobility. Over and over again, who comes out strongest? The state. By the early 1700s, in all of the European countries, the nobility had been either broken, as in the Fronde, or co-opted. Cromwell, in the end, in the English Restoration, co-opts the nobility. What happens to Cromwell? Anybody know? He dies. He actually gets lucky. He dies in his bed. Anybody know what happens to his son, who was still running the state? Yeah. Going through with kings. They come back and they murder you. So, what do you guys think?
I mean, it is Friday.
Where?
And it's back.
Yeah, 3 minutes. Let's keep going brief. Brief. Let's talk about the Spanish conquest. I want us to get into all the stuff, and I don't want us to get too far behind. Spain eventually is able to look west. Thanks to Columbus's discoveries, Spain discovers a new world. Columbus does not land where he thinks he lands in India. Where does he land?
Like in the,
The modern Caribbean. Hispaniola is the first of the islands he finds. Over the course of the years between 1492 and the mid-1550s, Spain sends lots of other expeditions out, all of which discovered that there is far more to what Columbus thought he found and far bigger than what Columbus expected to find. In the end, it will be several men who participated, not several, many men who participated in the Reconquista that will lead the Spanish conquering of what we consider the New World. These men are called what? The conquistadors. There's a singular one-to-one transition from the Reconquista to the capture of the New World. The same men that fought and ended the Reconquista head west, and it's their military expertise, their battle prowess, and ultimately their technology and germs that will conquer the empire. We'll pick back up on Monday with those conquests. Sound good? Questions, concerns? Have a good weekend.